Our fourth panelist today, Carrie Frederick Frost, is a scholar of Orthodox theology, a professor at Saint Sophia Ukrainian Orthodox Seminary, and a mother of 5. She received her PhD in theology, ethics, and culture from the University of Virginia. Her theological work includes such subjects as sacramental and liturgical theology, religion and literature, contemplative prayer, motherhood, family, childhood, and men and women in Orthodox Christianity. And her book, Maternal Body, A Theology of Motherhood from the Christian East, will be published in June this year. Yeah. I'll also say, it's not in her bio, but I'm going to add it. She's written a couple pieces for Public Orthodoxy that are among the absolute most read globally of the 300 pieces we've published. So they're really, really excellent. She is on the board of the Saint Phoebe Center for the Deaconess and is a founding member of the International Orthodox Theological Association. Dr. Frost.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Great. Good afternoon, Reverend Fathers, Presbyteras, members of the Order of St. Andrew, brothers and sisters in Christ. I offer my gratitude to the Archons, and in particular to Carrie Lambrakis, for his sleepless nights, for all his preparation, for hosting this event today, and for his daughter, Kira, very well-connected daughter, for pulling this together. Thank you very much for having us, and especially for the hospitality here at Saint Sophia as well. And thank you to all of you for taking your time and for sticking around for the final speaker. I appreciate you being here, and I feel like it's part of my mission as a scholar that works on this topic to not just come and speak about this issue, but to also really hear what you have to say and to really listen. And so I appreciated what some of you had to say to me at lunch and in the coffee break earlier. I really like hearing your feedback and your thought on this, so thank you for that. Before I start, I think it's germane to mention that my father, Eustace Frederick of eternal memory, was a member of the Order of St. Andrew himself. His parents emigrated to the United States from Russia in the early 20th century, and ended up mining coal in southern West Virginia. And he grew up in a Carpatho-Russian parish there. And it was his lifelong dedication to that parish and care of that parish and his leadership in the church, that leadership quality that Carrie spoke to earlier, and really his diaconal spirit. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the ethos of diaconia in a minute, that prompted Metropolitan Nicholas of the Carpatho-Russian Church of blessed memory to recommend him as an archon. And he actually didn't know what an archon was until he was nominated, until someone called him and told him about this. And so for him to be this second generation immigrant and to be nominated to this order was like almost an unimaginable honor. And when we went to New York for his induction, to be able to call out Axios for my father was just an incredible occasion for us, for our family. And so it's a really special honor for me to be here among you. Thank you again. And so now to my topic for today, which is the question, why now? When I speak to groups or individuals about the female diaconate, I'm often asked this question, why now? As in, why should we ordain women to the diaconate now? As in, if we haven't been doing it for quite some time, why should we begin now, here in the 21st century? And so I will first answer this question succinctly by borrowing the words from a fellow theologian. In the future, the church will either become diaconal or it will cease to exist. And so I'm going to repeat that. In the future, the church will either become diaconal or cease to exist. I've borrowed these words from the Roman Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, who spoke them about the Christian church in the broadest sense. But today I will claim them for the Orthodox Church. The threat that the church might cease to exist based on one thing or another is strong language, to say the least. And this is a challenging statement because it is so bold, but also because what it requires from the church, what it requires from us. A diaconal future of the church does not imply grandeur or success or a balanced church budget or comfort or a thriving church by many metrics that we might normally use. A diaconal church would be one of service, of humility, of willingness to co-suffer, of struggling, of risking relationships with the other, of kenotic love, and of service. This description throws into relief a way in which we do not, when it comes down to it, really value service. Our morning speaker, Archdeacon John Chrysavgis, observes, quote, "Unfortunately, if as Orthodox we are honest with ourselves, we must confess that we have tended to regard the notion of service as more lowly, as being less. Service is almost always perceived as something as markedly inferior value." I think we only need to think of what comes to mind when I say the words service industry. Despite the fact that we denigrate service, I believe that Karl Rahner is onto something in this need for the church to become diaconal. And I believe that this relates directly to why women should be ordained to the diaconate now, that this, in fact, answers this question, why now? And so I will develop 2 points. First, why the general diaconal mission of the church is necessary now, and how the ordained female diaconate will bolster the general diaconal character of the church. And second, why specifically the female diaconate is necessary now. I will develop these 2 points, and then at the end of my talk, I will return to Karl Rahner's provocative words, and I will make some further observations on them and how they relate to this question of why now. So first, why the general diaconal mission of the church is necessary now. The world is facing some difficulties now, you may have noticed, and the church has its difficulties too. Now, I am not the sort of theologian that is willing to argue that our time is any darker than any other in the church's history, but I do believe our time has many challenges, including some unique challenges. The diaconal nature of the church is what can help meet today's challenges. This is true both in the characteristics of diaconal service, the ethos of diaconal service, the spirit of diaconal service, and also in the pragmatic reality that a fully realized diaconate would bring about. I'll describe these 2 things, the ethos of diaconal service and the pragmatic reality of a fully realized diaconate. As for the ethos of diaconal service, I will again borrow from Archdeacon John Chrysavgis. And let me say as an aside, I'm very sad that he couldn't be here today, and especially for the reasons that he was not able to be here. He is a mentor and a good friend of mine, but there's one itty-bitty personal silver lining for me, which is that I am quoting from him twice in my talk, and the fact that he's not here means that he will not be able to tease me about the fact that we would have been in the same room and I would have been quoting from him. So I am spared. He identifies 3 qualities of the diaconal church, which includes laity and clergy, the whole church. They are co-suffering with others, humility, and the ethos of service itself. So these are the qualities we need as a church today. The willingness to suffer, co-suffering with others. We are shown and told in Scripture to bear one another's burdens. And I'll offer an illustration of co-suffering from the life of St. John Maximovich. This comes from when he was a bishop in San Francisco. One of his priests was staying up at night, fretting over a dire situation in his parish, worrying about it, but also praying about it, and just becoming more and more overwrought deep into the night. And so at 3 o'clock in the morning, this priest's phone rings, and he picks it up, and it's Bishop John. And Bishop John says, "My son, I will carry on your vigil. I will keep your prayers. Go to sleep." So Bishop John was so in tune with his priest that he knew in the middle of the night of his suffering, he experienced it too, and he took it on for him. He kept his vigil going. He took on his suffering, and he told him to go to sleep. Now, I don't think most of us can hope to attain this sort of clairvoyant quality of co-suffering like St. John had, which is part of what makes this example so entertaining. But we can work to be truly present with those around us and witness their suffering and ease their burdens in many ways. And this is one aspect of diaconal service, of a diaconal church. The second quality of diaconal service is humility. Now, humility, I think, is easily paired in our minds with service in a very general sense, but I think we have to also take care to pair humility with authority, because they go together too, and this is especially important when we're talking about the diaconate as a major order. And I think it's unfortunate because sometimes authority is understood to be about power. Even though they are sometimes used as synonyms, authority and power are distinct. Power is about control, which can tend very easily towards coercion and manipulation. Our ecclesiology, our understanding of the major orders of the church, is not built around power, but around authority instead. Authority entails leadership and possibility and many other qualities, but it requires this pairing, this being together with humility at every turn. And I will offer an example of this sort of humility coexisting with authority a little bit later in my talk. The third quality of a diaconal church is service, the attitude of diaconia itself. Mother Maria of Paris said, "It is not enough to give, we must have a heart that gives." Here there's a story about the desert-dwelling church mother Amasera, who lived in Upper Egypt. When a group of monks came to visit, she gathered together all of the fresh fruit from her community to offer them as an act of hospitality and respect. And this may seem like a sort of simple, unremarkable gesture for us today who can easily and cheaply obtain bananas from Peru in the dead of winter. But fresh fruit in the desert was a precious, delectable commodity, and this was an act of giving on her part. But then the monks, they took the fruit and they ate all the imperfect pieces. They ate the bruised pieces and the not quite ripe pieces or the overripe pieces, and they left the perfect pieces and gave those back to the nuns. And so this was this act, reciprocal act of giving, of diaconia back on their part. So this story illustrates this quality of giving within the ethos of a diaconal church. Even though the monks didn't themselves bring a gift, they had a heart that gives too. I also think of Deacon Lawrence of Rome of the 3rd century, when Emperor Valerian forced him to give over the church's treasury. And that was one of the administrative duties of some of the deacons in the early church, was to take care of the treasury of the church. Deacon Lawrence said, "Sure, give me a few days to collect it." And what he did is he took the entire treasury and he gave it to the poor. He took all the gold and all the money and all the jewels or whatnot and gave it to the poor. And then he gathered up the poor, all the widows and the orphans and the destitute and whatnot, and brought them to Emperor Valerian and said, here is the treasury of the church. This is the church's riches. That is a heart that gives. Now that I've described the qualities of a diaconal church and given some examples, let me speak to the pragmatic side of a church with a fully realized diaconate that will help us meet the challenges of the world today. The major orders are populated differently than they were in the early church. An example with which we are all likely to be familiar is the one bishop per city model, in which a hierarch oversees a flock in one manageable metropolitan area. The bishop to priest to deacon ratio was also very different in the early church, and we've heard this a couple times already today, but I will just say it again because I do think it's so fascinating, this idea of Justinian, his legal code in the 6th century of not more than 60 priests, 100 deacons, and 40 deaconesses. Like that idea of entering a church and seeing that quantity of priests, deacons, and deaconesses, that I would really like to see. Yeah. Now, because the major orders are populated so differently, our priests often serve without the support of the diaconate, which means that the liturgy itself changes, and more importantly, that the priest lacks the pastoral or administrative support that the diaconate would have traditionally provided. Most of the priests I know would gladly welcome some pastoral or administrative support. Yeah, there's some raising of hands happening right now and some nodding of heads, yes. Let's not forget the bishop, too. He is deprived of the ways a functioning diaconate benefits the church. We heard of this idea earlier of a deacon being the eyes and the ears of a bishop and having that route of communication, that loop of communication back to the bishop that can be so helpful. The laity also lacks the benefits from the liturgical, pastoral, and administrative participation of the diaconate, and the entire royal priesthood would be more fulfilled and their vocations as they were fully developed in the early church if the diaconate were once again fully realized today. And to me, this is the anti-clerical vision of the church that I referenced earlier in regard to a question this morning. And I see ways, although they are perhaps a little bit less obvious, that a renewal of the female diaconate would better the diaconal future of the church. Yes, deaconesses would just sheerly increase the numbers of the ranks, of the diaconate itself, but it's just not this alone. Their presence would vivify the diaconate as a whole and the diaconal efforts of the laity. Let me explain. A decision to reinstitute the female diaconate would raise the awareness of and the appreciation for the diaconate as its own office within the major orders. Diaconal training programs would receive more attention and become stronger. I want to be clear here, this is not any sort of subtle criticism of existing diaconal programs. I teach in one that I think is very good. Instead, I'm saying this in support of these programs, which are often not given the attention and funding that they deserve. The female diaconate would be a permanent diaconate. This would help correct the unfortunate trend in which the male diaconate has been reduced, as we've heard before, to a liturgical function or this one-day stepping stone to the priesthood. The male diaconate service ethos could be recovered. For all these reasons, the male diaconate would be richer for the female diaconate, and thus the whole church would become more diaconal. The diaconal character of the laity would also be encouraged by the presence of deaconesses. The diaconate has always occupied a special nexus between the laity and the clergy. Always intimately involved in the pastoral care of the flock, deacons and deaconesses would work with laity to meet the needs of their communities, both in the parish and the broader local community. This, too, would move the whole church in a diaconal direction. Now I'm going to move to my second answer to the question, why now? which is why the female diaconate in particular is critical to the diaconal mission of the church and is therefore necessary now. Sometimes when I'm asked this why now question, my answer begins with the conviction that the real question is why always the female diaconate? And this is because I believe the need for the female diaconate is in fact timeless. It is always needed, regardless of the era of the church or the geographical setting. The church is always impoverished without a full expression of the diaconate, as I've detailed so far, and specifically including deaconesses, as I will now assert. This is because there are two main reasons that we need the female diaconate that are constant. First, woman-to-woman ministry is always needed within the church. And second, the whole church always needs its women's gifts in ministry. First, woman-to-woman ministry. This is not an antiquated idea that we here in enlightened America have outgrown. There is a reason I belong to an all-women book group. There is wisdom behind the decision of the secular hospice, where I volunteer, to pair female respite caregivers with female patients and male respite caregivers with male patients. There are times when a woman needs to be ministered to by another woman. And yes, this does happen informally in parishes and book groups, but the good that could be done would be 100-fold more if there were theologically and pastorally trained women ordained as deaconesses ready to minister to other women with the oversight, support, and authority of the church. I will share a story that illustrates this point, because I've learned from talking about the female diaconate for several years now that these sorts of examples help us to see what we are missing without deaconesses and help us to better understand and envision what we would gain with deaconesses. In 1968, my mother delivered her first child, a full-term, stillborn baby boy. She called the priest and told him the news and asked him to come. And his words were, "There is nothing I can do for you." And that's all he said, and he hung up the phone. And those words are kind of seared on the family's consciousness, really. There's nothing I can do for you. Now, I don't know what his thinking was, but I suspect that because the church did not have any formal prayers or rites to deal with that situation of stillborn infants, that perhaps he felt he really, truly had nothing to offer. Still, he did not go to my parents. He did not offer any comforting words. He did not extend any pastoral care. Now, I believe that this situation likely would have played out very differently had there been an ordained deaconess on hand in my hometown parish. A woman in an ordained diaconal role with pastoral training and perhaps with childbearing experience of her own could have gone to my mother, even without an official rite for stillborn infants, and prayed with her, talked with her, and kept her company during this very difficult time. And let me just make a side note here and say, thankfully, that several churches in the United States and around the world are beginning now to address this matter of prayers for stillborn and miscarried infants and provide priests with a tool to use in this situation. In my years of writing and talking about the miscarriage and churching prayers, which are part of my scholarly work, this is a case where I hear and continue to hear from scores of women from how much, even when a priest did come, and did show up, how they would have preferred to have had a woman visit them in these few very vulnerable, physically and emotionally intense days after a miscarriage or a stillbirth or a death of an infant. And I've had 2 people this morning share your stories with me about that, and thank you for sharing those stories with me. Thinking back to my mother's situation, and what I'm about to say here I think is very important, I believe there are other good things that could have come to fruition had a deaconess been on hand. She might have also worked with the priest. Perhaps this was the first phone call he had ever received about a stillborn infant. He might have well been shaken and disturbed by this situation. A deaconess might have been able to minister to him. She might have been able to help him handle this situation. She might have been able to discuss this with him and come up with a plan as to how to minister to my parents together. Perhaps they both might have gone, with the deaconess spending time with my mother and the priest visiting with my father, and then all four of them coming together in prayer. There are many possibilities here. And what I think is so important about these possibilities that I'm tossing out is that they are examples of ways that a deaconess might work with clergy, that men and women might minister together in synergy. And this is really interesting to me. The benefits of woman-to-woman ministry are very straightforward and clear, I think. But the benefits the church would accrue from the synergy of ordained women and men working together, these are really untapped for us as Orthodox Christians and untold. But I believe they would be very deep and very rich and very real. And I believe we are missing out on those. Let me tell you the final chapter in the story of my mother's experience with her stillborn son. And this is a continuance of the true story, not my what-if musings, if things had happened differently. This is the true part of the story. So 30 years later, after the stillborn son, the priest that had said, "There is nothing I can do for you," was retiring. He had not been her parish priest for some time. He'd gone on to a different location, but he called her on the phone. And he said that as part of his process of retirement, he had been thinking back over his years of service, and that one of his biggest regrets was that he did not go to her at the hospital and minister to her in any way, and that he realized that had been a failure. And he said, "I know now that I failed you then." And so those words actually became kind of seared on the family's consciousness. I know now that I failed you then. And I said earlier that I would tell a story illustrating the diaconal quality of humility paired with authority. And for me, this is it. It took great humility and this proper understanding of the need for humility in a position of authority for this priest so many years later to call her and to say this and to ask for forgiveness. This is this ethos of diaconia and this quality of humility, and that it opened up an opportunity for healing for them both. The other way in which the church always needs deaconesses is that the whole church, not only women, needs women's gifts. Women have different lived experience of sexual abuse and assault from which the whole church would benefit. Women have different perspectives on authority, its judicious use, its squandering, its abuse from which the whole church would benefit. Women have a different view of child-rearing, marriage, family life from which the whole church would benefit, and so on. And again, yes, some of these gifts are already being shared with the church here in the 21st century, with women now on parish councils, teaching in seminaries, and so on, as reflected in Pat's list, and in many other ways. But this is not the same as the ways in which women's gifts would be truly infused into the life of the church if women were ordained to the diaconate and thus had the sacramental blessing of this ministry. Also, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I believe that there's this beautiful potential in having ordained men and women as deaconesses working together in ministry. As I understand it, the recognition of both the need for woman-to-woman ministry and the ways in which women's gifts benefit the entire church is what prompted the Patriarch of Alexandria to reinstitute the order of deaconesses in the African church. As to what is unique about today, I do propose two things. First of all, that the women's movement has been the occasion for much of the consideration around the renewal of the female diaconate in the Orthodox Church in recent years. The Rhodes meeting itself, that's been mentioned earlier, that was convened and hosted by Ecumenical Patriarch Demetrios, it was prompted by questions and changes in the larger ecumenical Christian community. The Orthodox theologian Elizabeth Behr-Sigel said that Rhodes was a turning point and questions of women attracting interest in our church that had prompted deeper conversation internal to the Orthodox Church. A happy result of the women's movement is that many Orthodox women have gone into fields that are traditionally diaconal work and received excellent training in these fields, such as chaplaincy. These women are addressing the ailments of our modern era, such as the epidemics of depression and anxiety. When we see more and more of these women with these skills serving in secular settings, but not able to integrate their work into the life of the church, because there is not a living female diaconate, or many other avenues for their work, for that matter, and given that there are no theological or canonical barriers for enacting the female diaconate, then any resistance to ordaining women to the diaconate just appears more and more illogical. Especially, I think, speaking to some of Kira's remarks earlier, to younger generations, who, both men and women, entirely accept women in these roles in secular settings. So, concluding now, I will return to Karl Rahner's prophetic words that I started with. In the future, the church will either become diaconal or will cease to exist. But now I wish to restate them affirmatively and directing them to the female diaconate. So my restatement is, the ordained female diaconate is essential to the diaconal future of the church and its mission in the world. I've already made my case for the relationship between the ordained female diaconate and the possibilities for a renewed diaconal character of the church and the hopeful future of the church, but you will note that I have added the word world here. This was quite deliberate. I was annoyed in some ways that I couldn't be quite as pithy as Rahner, but I felt strongly that the word world belonged. Up until now, I've spoken of the diaconal ministry within the church, but now I wish to speak to how it extends beyond the church. In a sense, this really should not be necessary because the church, by definition, is missionary. The church, by definition, should always be extending beyond itself. But it is a real temptation for us to be Orthodox Christians ministering to other Orthodox Christians. However, when we are our best selves, we remember the Great Commission, and we remember that we offer the Eucharist on behalf of all and for all. So I agree with Rahner's assessment, and as I have applied it specifically to the Orthodox Church, I truly believe that the ordained female diaconate is essential to the diaconal future of the church and its mission in the world. And this is the answer to why now. Thank you.